Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us here today on Blackboard.Collaborate. Before starting the webinar, I'd like to go over some practical information. In case of technical difficulties, you can contact one of our moderators with a private chat message. You can find them in the list of attendees. Please also note that Google Chrome is the only browser which supports Blackboard.Collaborate. You can turn off the pop-up notifications by changing your notification settings. Please feel free to post your questions for the keynote speakers in the chat. And lastly, this session will be recorded and will be made available on the UXIA website tomorrow. Thank you. And I will now like to give the floor to our moderator, Professor Ann van Craen.
Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening from wherever you are watching and joining us here, and welcome in this webinar. I'm Ann van Craen, professor in Christian social ethics at the KU Leuven here in Belgium, and in the name of UXIA, the Trans Economy of Hope Chair of the University of Antwerp and the Economy of Community in Belgium, I'm very happy to welcome you here for this webinar on profit and vocation, organized in the context of the economy of Francesco. But what is the economy of Francesco? Let's take a look.
Economie of Francesco is een initiatief van Paus Franciscus, die samen met jongeren, van welke achtergrond ook, om samen met hen na te denken over de nieuwe wegen die we uitgaan of willen uitgaan met onze economie. We bevinden ons op het randje van de draagkracht van onze planeet. We kunnen niet verder in een wereld die stuk is. Indien we ons kapitalistisch model niet heruitvinden, dan is het ten dode opgeschreven. En daarom de uitdaging om met die jongeren na te denken over alternatieven. En dat heeft de paus uiteraard heel goed begrepen.
Il no ad un'economia che uccide diventi un sì a un'economia che fa vivere, perché condivide, include i poveri, usa i profitti per creare comunione.
En vandaar Laudato Si, zijn ecologische encycliek, gaat uit van een drietal innoverende stellingen. Een eerste, het sociale en het ecologische, die vormen allebei twee zijden van dezelfde medaille. We kunnen niet zonder ook rekening te houden met de sociale implicaties van die ecologische oplossingen. Denk bijvoorbeeld aan energiebesparende maatregelen. In de mate dat die maatregelen te duur worden en onbetaalbaar, dan valt de hele categorie mensen uit de boot. Een tweede stelling is het feit dat het milieu beschouwd wordt of moet beschouwd worden als een collectief goed. En een collectief goed moet ook beheerd worden als collectieve goederen. Er is ook een derde innoverende stelling. De biodiversiteit is ook aanwezig in de economie en die moet gewaardeerd en bewaard worden. Er zijn de kapitalistische ondernemingen, maar daarnaast bestaan uiteraard ook een heel palet aan sociale ondernemingen. In de sociale economie, denk aan maatwerkbedrijven, er zijn ook de coöperaties, er zijn waardegedreven bedrijven. Economie moet beschouwd worden als een biosysteem. Niet alleen jongeren voelen zich aangesproken om na te denken over de toekomst van onze economie, maar ook ondernemers, werknemers, studenten en academici.
Donc, je suis Sylvain Craen, je travaille pour Triodos, la société Craen Assure Finance. Nous sommes courtiers en assurance et banquiers indépendants. Et au sein de notre société, l'économie de communion est très importante parce que l'éthique fait partie de nos valeurs de base.
Ik ben Joost, ik heb Astratec opgericht. Astratec is een machinebouwer. Astratec zou er zonder gemeenschapseconomie helemaal anders uitgezien hebben. Wij waren op reis in Sao Paulo en daar zagen wij die grote fabrieken juist naast de krottenwijken en dat had ons geraakt. En wij zeiden tegen elkaar, waarom deel die rijke fabrieken niet met de armen? Dat is eigenlijk waarom ik met die gemeenschapseconomie gestart ben en dat ik dat verder doe.
Donc donner, ce n'est certainement pas que de l'argent, ça peut être donner du temps, ça peut être donner des compliments, ça peut être donner des conseils. Donc il y a une multitude en fait, de manières de pouvoir exploiter cette culture du don.
Dat kan zich ook uiten en proberen een goede service te geven, ook als dat financieel niet altijd interessant is.
Et c'est justement ce travail plus respectueux, plus humain, qui va permettre à l'être humain de s'épanouir au sein de l'entreprise, au sein du travail, et qui va permettre sur le long terme d'avoir une économie qui tourne mieux et qui tourne de manière plus durable.
Gemeenschapseconomie is altijd een verhaal van mensen kansen geven. Mijn eerste werknemer was een ex-drugsverslaafde, maar die heeft nu een normaal gezin en een werk en heeft zich terug kunnen in de maatschappij brengen.
In België hebben we het bedrijvencentrum Solidaar, waar een aantal ondernemers samen onder één dak gehuisvest zijn.
Solidaar moet er zijn om gemeenschapseconomie uit te dragen, om bekendheid te maken en om mensen de kans te geven in het idee van gemeenschapseconomie met een zaak te kunnen beginnen.
Et donc là, Solidaar a sa place aussi pour justement être une plateforme pour engendrer de nouvelles entreprises avec cette nouvelle mentalité.
In het kader van Economia Francesco gaat er in Assisi een event door tussen 19 en 21 november. Maar parallel zijn er ook op verschillende plaatsen in de wereld bijeenkomsten, ontmoetingen, meetings, waar uitwisselingen tussen ondernemers, tussen onderzoekers zullen plaatsvinden. Het initiatief van Paus Franciscus is een ideale, vruchtbare bodem om daarmee aan de slag te gaan. Er is heel veel potentieel. Onder studenten, onder jongeren. Aan creativiteit ontbreekt het zeker niet. Zolang er hoop is, is er een perspectief. En dat perspectief willen we ook valoriseren.
So, as the movie recalls, Pope Francis called upon young scientists, students, and entrepreneurs to reflect on our current economy in order to redesign it towards a more just, inclusive, and sustainable global economy for the common good. Over 3,500 people were supposed to meet in Assisi within 2 weeks. Due to the circumstances, it switched to an online event, or even more so, a global movement with many local and global activities like these webinars we are hosting here. Since 3 decades, the worldwide network of Economy of Communion already works for more people-centered market economy. Together with many other organizations, it embraces and sustains Pope Francis' call, and since it is active here in our Belgian context, we have chosen to include it in this story as part of the worldwide network which is evolving in the context of this Economy of Francesco. Today, in this webinar, Profit and Vocation, we want to address the question on the role of the financial market and institutions in creating such a more just economic system. But still reminiscing the financial crisis of 2008 and taking into account the current economic problems, it seems we are facing the limits of a system which is exclusively focused on growth. So how can we move toward a financial market which serves society? We have 2 distinguished speakers to give us some insights on the matter at hand. Our first speaker, Mrs. Ann Pettifor, is best known for a prediction of the great financial crisis in her book, The Coming First World Debt Crisis, published in 2016, so only 2 years, 2006 rather, so only 2 years before the financial crisis hit off. In that year, she co-authored The Green New Deal, published by the New Economics Foundation. And other publications are The Productions of Money on the Nature of Money, Debt, and the Finance Sector, as well as The Case for the Green New Deal. In 2018, the Henrik Bol Foundation awarded her for the Hannah Arendt Prize. She is a council member of the Progressive Economy Forum and director of Prime Economics, a network of Keynesian microeconomists. She has an honorary doctorate from the University of Newcastle for her work leading to an international movement for the cancellation of the debts owed by 35 low-income countries. So, Mrs. Pettifor, it's really an honor to have you here with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to share, first of all, may I say that it's a very, it's a great honor to be here, and I want to thank you for including me. This is a great thing. I'm just going to, first of all, open my slides so that I can share these with you. Here they come, I hope. clicked on it. It says share now. And here's the first one. So my presentation is titled Money, Power and Ecological Transformation. But really, my presentation is going to be about the transformation of the finance sector in order for us to address the threats that we face outlined, the threat of imbalances, of insecurity, of inequality, above all, the threat of ecological breakdown. I want to begin with a quote from Franklin D. Roosevelt, which on this day, when we're listening to the results of the American presidency, seemed to me to be so incredibly pertinent to our situation. When he addressed the Congress in 1938, he said, "The first truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state self." That, in its essence, is fascism. Ownership of government by an individual, by a group, or by any other controlling private power. Among us today, a concentration of private power without equal in history is growing. And industrial empire building, unfortunately, has evolved into banker control of industry. We oppose that. Now, he said that, and he addressed Congress along those lines in 1938, when he was fully aware of the rise of fascism in Europe and where he was fighting to prevent the rise of fascism in the United States. And we see exactly what he warned of: concentration of power, private power, and the eclipsing of public authority over the system as the basis of fascism. So let us just then refer to Alan Greenspan, who was widely acclaimed for his role as governor of the Federal Reserve in the years before the great financial crisis. He said something which is terribly pertinent to my contribution today. He said once, "Thanks to globalization, policy decisions in the United States have been largely replaced by global market forces. National security aside, it hardly makes any difference who will be the next president. The world is governed by market forces." So here you see that both Alan Greenspan and Franklin D. Roosevelt are in agreement. It really doesn't matter who the Americans elect as their president. The world is governed by market forces. And that's not an accident. That has happened as a result of the crisis of our system, and our system is known, of course, as financial globalization. It works effectively to protect the interests of the globalized rentier class based on Wall Street, also the City of London and Frankfurt, in just the same way as the gold standard of the 19th and early 20th century protected global interests based in the City of London. Now, Quinn Slobodian, who's written a wonderful book about the globalists, explains to us that Friedrich Hayek and the Geneva School argued that, to their minds, commitments to national sovereignty and autonomy were dangerous if taken seriously, believing that nations must remain embedded in an international institutional order that safeguarded capital and protected its right to move throughout the world at its whim. Right? In other words, what these people, Friedrich Hayek and the Geneva School, advocate was for capital, globalized capital, to be released from the restraints of domestic regulation and protected, encased. He uses the term encased, and protected from any intervention by governments. That is what they dreamed of as the ideal world, and that is the world that we have today as a result of that thinking. The encasement of global capital markets to protect them from democracy would require, said Friedrich Hayek, the dethronement of politics. And we got the dethronement of politics soon after this theory was propagated. We got that with the rise of fascism. So, you know, we know that this could happen again. And we see, for example, in the world that we live in today, the capital markets are booming despite the pandemic. People have been moved, prevented crossing borders. Trade supply lines have been broken down. It's harder now to move things in and out of countries. Barriers have been raised, and more barriers will be raised under Trumpian government. But capital has met no restraint whatsoever in its ability to move. That power it still has. And that partly explains why American billionaires were $434 billion richer during the pandemic. Mr. Amazon is just, while he sits there quietly, while we sit here quietly, he's already accumulating close on $1 billion an hour. So this is rentier capitalism, rentierism, i.e. this is capitalism which uses the power to create money, to rent from money. And as the creation of money is a relatively effortless experience, because money is not a commodity, it's not barter, it's the creation of a promise to pay over a period of time with a contract and on the basis of a rate of interest. And as such, it is a social technology. It is not a technology. It's not a commodity technology. Right? It's a social arrangement. And as a result of that easy social arrangement of make promises to pay, governments, private sectors issuing credit can collect rent almost effortlessly. And so today, the global economy is governed by rentierism. Wherever the corpse is, it says in Matthew 24:28, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And they sure are gathering now during this pandemic. So if we want an example of this kind of vulturism, this kind of rentierism, we just need to look at private equity firms. They mobilize pools of capital from wealthy individuals, pension funds and hedge funds, and use these savings to take a stake in a business paid for, not with the savings, but with borrowed money, credit or debt, a process known as a leveraged buyout. Borrowed capital is preferred because debt attracts tax breaks. Right? Just as we may put down a deposit on a property and purchase the rest with borrowed money, so private equity firms put down a comparatively small amount of cash to buy a targeted business and then aggressively borrow or leverage large sums to pay the purchase. Right? Whereas you and I gradually repay our mortgage, repay the debt that we own, private equity does something different. It loads the debt onto the targeted firm, like a football club, a housing association, or a railway company, and makes the users of those assets, football fans, residents, or travelers, repay the rent on the debt. That is both the interest and principal repayment by forking out railway fares, football match tickets, or monthly rents. This is a way of effortlessly creating, accumulating wealth without being directly involved or without bearing full responsibility for the borrowing. Partly as a result of this parasitic business model, the corporate sector has been saddled with what the IMF believes is about $19 trillion of debt, considered by the IMF to be at risk, by firms whose earnings would not cover the cost of their interest expenses in a crisis such as the current one. So we see in this current crisis where central banks have had to guarantee the debts of these big corporations and protect them because these are debts that would never be repaid. This is effectively a kind of jubilee, but it's a jubilee that's being given, if you like, to the creditors, not to the debtors. That's a different point we'll discuss later. So rent from existing assets. So part of what's wrong about the rentier capitalist system is that it extracts rent from existing assets, and it doesn't do what capitalism promised us, which is to be dynamic and entrepreneurial and create new assets. So, for example, Richard Branson, who's one of our billionaires, rents out his assets, which is a railway line, gyms, banks, and airlines. And he doesn't often own these, but he rents them out. And those royalty payments are paid to him, a very rich tax exile, in his British Virgin Island tax haven. So he belongs to this global economy's class of rentiers who are, by escaping from the regulation of domestic economies, are encased, are protected from the intervention, if you like, of democratic regulation. That's the system that we have today. And the consequence of this system of allowing banks to create masses of credit to burden corporates and individuals and households with debt is that we have mountains, not even Himalayan mountains of debt relative to the world's real income. Something like 3 times the world's income is now in terms of, can now be defined in terms of financial assets. And that's unsustainable, because if you have debt at that level, you've got to have enough income to repay it ultimately. And if you don't, then that debt becomes a huge burden, both on society, on the economy, but on corporations and individuals. I had a number here, but you can see my PowerPoint has been distorted. It's such a big number that dear old PowerPoint can't absorb the numbers of noughts that go into it. These are numbers that have come from the Financial Stability Board, which show us that total financial assets in the world are something like $382 trillion. Now that's something beyond human imagination. Those owned by people by firms in the differences amount to $184, $117 trillion. So very huge numbers of relative to the global income. And the total credit to the non-financial sector, according to the Bank for International Settlements, in other words, the money that's been lent is something like $183 trillion to those corporates that are not in the finance sector. Again, that vastly eclipses the global economy's ability to generate income to repay those debts. And that is going to crash at some point, and society will pay the price. Never mind the ecosystem. Central banks, and this is now out of date past the pandemic, but central banks have expanded their balance sheets massively to protect this sector from their own massive mistakes. And those that if you like, that central bank largesse, that generosity of the central banks exists largely because we taxpayers give authority to central banks. We do that by faithfully paying our taxes every year, and the fact that the central bank and the treasury is backed by, say, in the case of Britain, 30 million taxpayers, in the case of Europe, something like 120 million taxpayers. That's what gives the ECB and the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve its authority. So we are effectively expanding these balance sheets with the authority, with public authority. All these banks, these central banks, are public banks, they're not private banks, backed by the taxpayer, and they are bailing out the private finance sector for its reckless, excessive creation of credit. So we need to build a new international financial architecture. There's no question about that. We don't talk about that. And one of the reasons I've raised this today is that I think it's absolutely fundamental that we move away from talking about individuals, no matter how good they are, corporations, no matter how good they are, or even banks, no matter how good they are, because they all operate within an international framework, a financial architecture, which compels them to behave in certain ways which are creating instability and volatility and political instability as well. So the reason we have to think about building a new international financial architecture is the reason expressed by this wonderful young woman, Greta Thunberg. She says that in order to avoid climate breakdown, will require what she calls cathedral thinking. This is a beautiful analogy. We have to think big, and we have to think in terms of architecture. And she then says we must lay the foundation while we may not know exactly how to build the ceiling. We don't know quite how we're going to transform this internal financial system. But if we, in the first place, don't even talk about it, there's no way that we can even lay the foundation. The foundation is to begin by talking about it, by admitting to it, and about arguing and talking about how we should change it. And the reason why it's important is because JP Morgan Chase, the biggest bank in the world, has, since the Paris Club Agreement, reportedly lent $196 billion to the fossil fuel sector in the first 3 years after the Paris Club Agreement. Over that same time, Exxon, which is a big bad oil company, has in 3 years invested just $9 billion, $3 billion each year to extract oil. So we can see that the banks are by far the biggest funders of fossil fuel than even the oil companies are. So, and as Bill McKibben rightly argued in a beautiful article in the New York Times, money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns. Now, to understand that, can I just briefly say this? We need to understand that money is this social construct, credit, credo, I believe you will pay, I promise to pay. Money is nothing more than a promise to pay. If that money is not regulated, then we can make promises, massive promises, and we can make promises that can never be fulfilled, right? But then if we promise to pay, we get given, for example, a credit card. I promise to pay. That enables me to go shopping on Amazon, and I spend and I spend, and I buy and I buy, and I go crazy about fashion or whatever, motor cars or whatever it is I want to buy, and that fuels greenhouse gas emissions. That's the linkage between money, consumption, and greenhouse gas emissions. And until we understand that, and until we think of the ecological crisis as being integrated with a financial crisis, we won't be able to address the ecological crisis. So how to build an international system, that is really hard. But we can take inspiration from someone who's done it before, Franklin D. Roosevelt. So Franklin D. Roosevelt was a monetary radical, and he was fiscally conservative. He had many, many faults, and I'm not here to idolize him. But the great thing that he did was he was governor of the state of New York in 1929 during the Great Crash, and he watched over New York as 5,000 American banks failed. 5,000 American banks, and an average 100,000 of jobs vanished each week, and almost 25% of the American workforce was unemployed by the end of Roosevelt's governorship in 1932. And you need to know that a fascist movement titled America First began to emerge at this moment in American history. And luckily, Roosevelt was elected. And he then makes this extraordinary speech at his inauguration, in which he complains about practices of the unscrupulous money changers who stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men. Faced by the failure of credit, they have proposed only the lending of more money. The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization, thanks to the 29 crash. We may now, he said, restore that temple to the ancient truths. And here he is drawing on a biblical analogy to help his people understand what it was that he was going to do. And on the night of his inauguration, the very night of his inauguration, he began the process of dismantling the international financial architecture, which at that time was called the gold standard. And that night he said, I want private banks to hand over all their gold. I want to put the government in the driving seat of the economy, not Wall Street. And his advisor said to him, I'm sorry, President, you can't do this on a Sunday morning. It's a holy day. People are going to church. Well, he said, I'll wait till Monday. So they waited till Monday. He declared a bank holiday, and he demanded that the banks hand over their gold. And so he began the process of dismantling the gold standard, the international, first the American gold standard, and then the international gold standard. You can read the history of this in an excellent book by Eric Rauchway, an American economist who has detailed this period in great. So he began that, and in the process of doing so, he placed a democratic government in the driving seat of the economy. In other words, he said Wall Street is no longer going to do what Alan Greenspan explains, govern the international markets. Instead, that is going to be done by the democratically elected government. By the way, I had to search for a picture of him driving, and of course he couldn't drive because he was disabled. But I did manage to find this image of him in a car, in the driving seat of a car. So here you see his Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, with John Maynard Keynes. Morgenthau wrote in his diaries that we moved the financial capital from London and Wall Street right to my desk at the Treasury. In other words, democratic oversight and regulation of the system took place. And that took place through political willpower and through the advice of a brilliant economist, John Maynard Keynes. There was nothing, I'm not pretending that this was perfect. It did lead, for example, to the creation of jobs for men and women. It led to the dismantling of Wall Street's economic power. This man, the ambassador from Wall Street, was one of the bankers at the time. And it led to, it enabled the Roosevelt administration to spend in ways the banks would not have allowed him to do on Social Security for the elderly and for children. And above all, it enabled him to tackle the biggest crisis they faced at the time, which was an ecological crisis known as the Dust Bowl. The Great Plains, the United States suffered from the desertification of the Great Plains of the United States, which had decimated agriculture, caused massive poverty and migration. And this was a huge crisis they were facing then. And what taking back control of the financial system did was to enable Roosevelt to finance investment in restoring the soil to health, setting up these conservation corps, and planting, I believe it's 3, some people say 4 billion trees. It also invested in the arts. He sponsored, for example, subsidized the writing of the Grapes of Wrath, and so on and so forth. So what this shows us is that it can be done. We can transform the international financial architecture. We can restore public authority over the financial system and the international financial system, but it will take political will. In 1945, the Bretton Woods system was established, and that echoed quite a lot of what Roosevelt had done. But by 1957, that system was beginning to be undermined. Private authority, which took over the euro-dollar market. And then since then, we've had crisis after crisis, increasingly intense crises, recurring crises, and growing inequality, and so on and so forth. It is time, as the Financial Times has said, for capitalism to face a reset. It's time for us to build a Green New Deal. Thank you very much, Chair. I hope I haven't exceeded time.
Thank you, Mrs. Pettifor. It's okay. We don't have time to summarize your points, but thank you for pointing both to the major problems we are facing in this regard, but also how political will can help us to get us out of this impasse. After this theoretical account on the societal role of financial markets, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Mr. Van Craen. With a degree in mechanical engineering and a postgraduate degree in international finance, Mr. Van Craen has been working in the banking world for more than 25 years. In 2016, he works at the Triodos Bank, first in the head office in the Netherlands, and now as the managing director of Triodos Bank Belgium. As such, he is well suited to provide us with a concrete, practical testimony of a new ethical player in the financial sector. For Triodos Bank is a frontrunner in sustainable banking. It is serving more than 700,000 clients in 5 countries, and it exclusively finances projects that have a positive environmental, social, and cultural impact in sectors such as renewable energy, healthcare, or sustainable real estate. Mr. Thomas Van Craen, thank you very much for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. It's It's an honor to be here with you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to your audience today. And what an honor to come after Anne. Thank you very much for these insights, which I can only agree with. Yeah, I'm just trying to see how I can jump from such, let's say, a broad perspective on the need for a different financial regulation to the example that Triodos Bank is trying to set, because it is clear also to us that the current regulatory environment is failing on different accounts. I think, for example, on the fact that we learn new words after the previous crisis. For example, banks that are too big to fail. And we see currently that, at least for the ECB and perhaps from other regulators, that they are working towards even more concentration in the financial sector. So the question which is in my mind is not whether there will be another financial crisis, but when it will come. And I think this is also something that you hinted at. And if the financial crisis comes, or when the next financial crisis will happen, what the effect of it will be. Now, this is not what I want to talk to you about today, although I'm sure it's a fascinating topic. What I would like to talk to you about today is how, even in an environment that does not recognize fully the value of sustainability and that cannot think long term anymore, at least in terms of the common good, it is actually possible to develop enterprises that are based on different values of cooperation, of the common good, of communion, like was said in the introductory video, of brotherhood, equality, and liberty. That it is actually possible to take individual responsibility, even if collectively this responsibility is failing. And before I jump into the example of Triodos Bank, I perhaps want to explain why a bank is important and what role it can have in society. The bank, a bank performs different functions. The one that I would like to highlight today is the fact that all banks together, collectively, make on a daily basis millions of decisions about which projects, which enterprises get finance and which don't. In other words, they decide collectively on what can exist, which change can be accelerated, and what should cease to exist, or what change should not take place. So we understand deeply at Triodos Bank that these decisions are not neutral. The way banks use the money entrusted to them by savers is not neutral. So all financial decisions have an impact, whether it's positive or negative. And what I would like to explain to you today is how Triodos Bank goes about taking this responsibility entrusted to us by our savers and shareholders to maximize the positive impact and minimize the negative impact of money. This is enshrined in our vision that you can see on the screen, where I think it is clear that being a bank and money, besides being a social construct, is also a means to create a life in which people and nature can thrive. And the peculiarity about Triodos Bank is that this mission is enshrined in the Articles of Association drafted perhaps more than 40 years ago by visionaries, if you ask me, who included this core idea as in the Articles of Association. Another core idea that you will see in this paragraph is that Triodos Bank is pursuing a broad definition of sustainability that is fundamentally about relationships, our relationship with nature, our relationship with each other, and our relationship with ourselves. And the question we ask ourselves every day is how we can put a bank and money to the use, or to how we can ensure that money is being used to progress on all these relationships. I would like to talk briefly about two examples of how we translate this mission. One is on how we make lending decisions, what I hinted in my introduction, and secondly, how we translate that in our investments decision. So it is core, as I explained, that we follow broad definition of sustainability, where not only the relationship with the environment, but with ourselves and with each other is being taken care of. And so these are the three main axes on which we are going to assess every project that we are going to finance. We're going to do a sustainability assessment, an impact assessment, besides obviously a risk and financial assessment. These assessments that are going to look both quantitatively and qualitatively at the impact of the project are also based on what we call minimum criteria or minimum standards. You see a hyperlink in the presentation there, and these are this is the minimum bar that every one of our projects has to meet to avoid and limit negative impacts. For example, we are not going to finance tobacco, pornography, or nuclear energy. Or if we finance the mining sector, we will be looking, for example, at the way that employees are treated in these mines. And clearly, you will understand that currently no mining endeavor is meeting these minimum criteria. This assessment is qualitative and quantitative, as I explained, and often, like always, like I would say every human endeavor, nothing is black and white. So there is always an element of judgment call that we perform collectively as a bank on behalf of the savers. And because some of these judgment calls, we call them dilemmas, are not always very clear, one of the core values in developing our business is to provide the most transparency as possible. And so we publish on our website all the credit decisions and all the projects that are financed, better said, so that our savers can assess what's happening with their money, how it's being used, and start a conversation and challenge us when we made certain decisions that they feel for one reason or another is not appropriate. And this leads to a portfolio that is invested obviously in renewable energy, but also in hospitals or retirement homes, or in the cultural sector, films, theater, many sectors that currently are quite heavily hit by the COVID crisis. When we talk about investments, the situation is slightly different. The core is the same, but the expression is different. As in lending, we are mostly lending to SMEs, but in the investments sphere, we're providing investment funds that invest in listed equities and bonds. So using the same approach would lead perhaps not such a good result. So the way we approach our investment strategy there is that we have determined the 7 most important transition themes. You can see them on your screen. We apply the same minimum standards, and our investments are done with the same transparency. And we look at these enterprises that are listed that actually prove themselves to be front runners in one or several of these themes. So, for example, our funds are invested in Danone, who also active in dairy, is also showing leadership in terms of reducing their ecological footprint and investing in the development of plant-based diets, for example. We create impact, we feel, as part of a community, and I'm sorry that these numbers are a little bit, they're not well aligned, but these are the numbers of 2019 and 2018. In the narrow sense of the word of community, we have 721,000 customers, of which 44,000 shareholders or deposit holders, as we call them, and approximately 1,500 co-workers serving the entire community. And the fact that this business model makes sense is reflected by the fact that we are a growing enterprise in terms of balance sheet, in terms of loans, and also in terms of profit. Our profit is humble, but we feel is appropriate to the type of activities we develop, the risks we run, and appropriate related to the impact we want to have in society. The impact we generate is obviously not only financial, but it's also non-financial. And there we have pioneered our impact reporting, which we try to make as accessible as possible, so that one can actually assess what is created as positive impact or positive outcomes with the money entrusted to us. And as our financial results, these impact numbers are audited by our external auditor. We want to go beyond, and we are going beyond dealing respectfully with the money of our savers and maximizing the positive impact of the loans that we extend. We also, and we call this activity finance change, we also want to take our responsibility in changing the financial system through delivering and realizing a business model that actually has proven in the last 40 years to be more than viable and to have a place in society, but also by being explicit about our vision, for example, on the economy post-COVID, but also on the necessary transitions in certain sectors, like in our food and agricultural systems or in the energy system, and translating these theory of changes into, for example, lending criteria and lending priorities, but also in designing tools to help the entire sector to progress on the path to more sustainability. And I'm just flagging here the example of PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, which is an open source methodology, which is now global and enables banks to report transparently their footprint of their greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's generated emissions, sequestered emissions, or avoided emissions. We have now, as the Triodos Bank, done 2 reportings already. In 2019, we have reported 100% of our investment and loans portfolio. We're very proud about that. We're now working on improving the quality of the data underpinning this report. I'm very happy to mention that already 2 banks have signed on to PCAF in Belgium. This is public information. It's KBC and Argenta, and we hope, because it's clearly a necessity, that more banks will follow and combine the reporting of their footprint with setting ambitious science-based targets. To conclude, I want to show you that Triodos Bank is not alone. We're a founding member of the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. which includes more than 60 financial institutions across the globe, all united by the fact that we are together values driven and see banking as a means to progress society. And to help you answer a question whether a financial institution is serving society and not the other way around, perhaps you can have a look at the scorecard which is being used to determine whether a bank is able to join the Global Alliance for Banking on Values, because this scorecard is actually quite a good reflection on how we look at the role of banks and how banks can take their responsibility to enable us to progress and to create positive impact. And it deals with a triple bottom line approach, with financing only the real economy, with transparency, with long-term perspective and long-term resiliency, and obviously having a client at the center, not as a consumer, but as a human being, and all supported by a culture that enables to develop this in everything that we do. And so with this, I would like to conclude my remarks, and I'll give you back the word, Ellen.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for pointing out how banks constantly take decisions, moral decisions even, and for showing how the relational view of Triodos Bank is grounding its activities and also its contribution to change the financial system, which is highly needed, as we heard. We have still about 10 minutes for Q&A. So I might just start with a question that came up in the chat. So we've talked about the problem we are facing. We've also talked about the role of banks, but someone questioned, Lucy Evers, more importantly, questioned, to what extent a different ownership structure of the companies can help deal with these questions on the financial markets. For instance, can a cooperative help to get out of this global financial game? And she said, the moral of the source of capital determines the moral of a company, its processes, and the use of profit. So if we change where this capital comes from and how it is used in the company, can we then make changes in the system as well? Does any one of you want to respond? Yeah, go ahead. You're muted. Yeah.
Okay. Trick we never learn properly. So I think it's extremely hard for a small cooperative company to have an impact on the system. So I mean, we need to think of this co-op operating within a bigger system, and it's that system which shapes the co-op, right? And that's why it's so hard for cooperatives and for credit associations, for these community organizations to survive. You know, for example, if they want to attract savings, then they will be competing with the big banks who will pay more for those savings. In other words, will offer higher rates of interest. So then they can't attract savings except by offering higher rates of interest, and that makes their model, their economic model, unsustainable. But the other point is this, that in a world of capital mobility, you're not competing with other banks in your own community. You're competing globally, right? It's like, you know, if you own a shop in the high street and you decide to go online, you're not competing in your community the way you used to be to attract customers. You're competing with Amazon, right? And no matter how hard you try as a small individual company to function within this bigger system, you're going to be defeated by Amazon. So until we change the system whereby Amazon or the big banks or the big financial institutions have this power to be global and to move their money as they will and to avoid taxes, which is what they do, of course, because of capital mobility, that makes it very hard for a small co-op that's trying to live within the law and to operate ethically. So I think that it's possible to do, but I think it's heroic. I think what Triodos is doing is heroic. It's hard work. against the mainstream banking system. I work with many Islamic bankers, and the Islamic banking has as a fundamental principle that bankers shouldn't charge interest. They should instead have a stake in the business. They should take a stake in the business, and when the business makes losses, the banker makes losses. When the business makes gains, the banker makes gains. That's the theory of Islamic banking. But in a world of global mobility, capital mobility, Islamic banks can't survive. They can't survive on that principle, and so they cheat and they charge interest rates in order to attract savings and so on. So I think these banks can do well, and we should undermine the system by supporting them, by making the sacrifice of, if you like, of supporting co-ops and so on. But we shouldn't think that alone they can change the global system. That needs a bigger state intervention.
Yes, and it also relates to something that came up in the chat, just as a remark, that in fact it's not only this the system and the companies, etc., that has to change, but we as consumers as well. I mean, in a way, we are Amazon. There was this opinion article a few years ago. We are all Amazon, so it also depends on how we buy and sell. But it's very hard. It's also common in the chat. It's very hard for individual people to even grasp what is going on, let alone feel that they can actually do something about it.
Yeah.
Maybe for you, Thomas.
Can I add one point on shareholdership, because I fully agree with what Anne is saying, and actually I think this tension that Anne is maybe heroism, but I'd rather have someone outside the bank tell that about us than myself. But the tension that we feel is really present. The fact that we are in the system and at the same time we're challenging the system. So that's extremely hard to do. I think the way we go about this is that we try to attract the shareholders that understand that besides financial value, there are many other forms of values that we create, and that's why we also invest quite a lot in making these different types of values also visible, so that clients can see that besides financial value, they also have an impact on many different areas, and we take these impact areas and the reporting about that very, very seriously. And then we can go into whether it should be a cooperative or we have a very peculiar ownership structure or another. That's a very different field of activity. But there is I think a way to deal with this if the articles of associations are aligned with the mission, and if the shareholdership is aligned with the mission, and if the management is aligned with the mission, and if the governance ensures perennity of the mission. And I think this would be, at the end of the day, the check whether the company will remain true to the values or succumb to the forces of the system.
On that note, there was a question on who are the shareholders of Triodos Bank? Thomas?
Well, anyone who wants to invest in the bank is, we have more than 70,000 shareholders across Europe. And I think if you want more information, go to our website. But we have very limited institutional investors. Actually, less and less institutional investors are interested in products like our shares, because they don't perform like typical market products.
Okay. I see that it's already almost 5 o'clock, but just a question to both of you to end this session. If we go back to the movie that we started with, which value mentioned in the opening video of The Economy of Francesco is the most important one for you today? Why? So could we conclude that behind the crisis of our financial economic system, there's a lack of awareness that our society needs an openness of recultivating values and virtues? So which values is for you the most important one if you think about a new financial world and new economy for today?
It's hard to say, I mean, there are so many values, but I think I think it's solidarity above all else, you know, that we are a common humanity and we share a common life support system. If we dismantle that life support system, we all die, not just some of us, you know, we will all suffer. And it's that need to move from individualism and caring only about individuals towards a more solidarity-based economy, one in which we act collectively to provide services which benefit everyone. That's the one that matters to me.
Okay, thank you. Thomas?
Yes, of course, I cannot disagree with Anne. Perhaps what I would like to add is going from a short-term to a long-term perspective. And when I talk about long-term, really long-term, generational view, I think this is what we're missing today. And if you want to be cynical, you could say just self-preservation. If as a species we want to remain on Earth, we will have to act and do things differently.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I hear the same reaction on the chat. Here. Okay. Unfortunately, the hour is over. I would have loved to talk for a lot longer with all of you, and I see that the response in the chat could open up discussion even more. So, but I'm afraid we have to end it here to conclude the session. But in name of all the partners for this webinar, I really want to thank both of you for your interesting and enlightening comments and reflections, etc. And I also want to thank all the participants. They were very quiet, but they were there. I hope you thought it was enriching and inspiring. And I also hope that you might join us next week when we have a webinar on women and work, so the second one in this series, as prequels to the event of the Count of Francesco. So take care, stay safe, and thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.